Alrighty, question 2. I'm going to try and make this one a little bit shorter. The last one was 40 minutes, so here we go. Let's see how I do. Okay, so resting membrane potential, RMP. So how I like to think about this is resting membrane potential is the cell, and it's how much the cell, how much is difference between the outside and the inside, and where it's at when the cell is at equilibrium, right? So inside the cell is about -70, and that's what it's maintaining, right? The things that establish resting membrane potential, the book talked about three main things, and so I was just going to mention those because I feel like they're the most important. You have the sodium potassium ATPase, right, that pumps 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in, which then it said provides about 15 millivolts towards this -70 here. And then we've got negatively charged proteins, so proteins, negatively charged proteins, and then also the potassium leak channels, which let the potassium leak out. Okay. These three things are three main things that maintain this -70 millivolts, and this is just kind of what keeps this charge separated across this membrane, so that way when we need to have things happen, it can have the energy required to kind of pump things in or pump things out. And we'll get into action potentials in a bit. The next thing, characteristics, properties of the cell membrane that account for resting membrane potential's development. So things that account for that is one thing is the phospholipid bilayer, right? So this is kind of a quick drawing of a segment of what it would look like, right? So you've got this hydrophobic section out here and hydrophilic section out here, right? And so very small things can cross, but not anything very large or charged. So like non-polar things can also cross, such as CO2 and oxygen, right? We talked about that last time. But large things or charged things like potassium or sodium, sorry, that's not a great drawing there. Potassium or sodium, I can say this is the inside, outside. Can't cross because of its charge, okay? And so that's one thing that helps maintain that gradient. Another thing is channels. We've got channels that are very specific, right? It's not going to let just anything come in and out of the cell. It's going to be very specific, right? So for potassium leak channels, only potassium is going to be able to flow in or out of those leak channels. Okay. What conditions or factors affect the resting membrane potential's magnitude or size? That could be mostly stuff out of the cell, right? So the inside of the cell, I feel like stays relatively the same, and it's really hard to change that unless we add something to the extracellular fluid first, right? So if we had a lot of sodium in our extracellular fluid, I'm not going to say sodium because that one doesn't change. I'm going to say potassium because that'll be a little easier to explain. If we had a lot of potassium out here, the driving force, which we'll talk about in a sec, would be smaller, so less potassium would be rushing out of the cell. So this might become more positive, because potassium is a positive ion. So if it's not leaving the cell as fast, the electrochemical gradient, I guess that's one thing that also maintains this balance, is the chemical gradient for this is going to be lower, so the electrical gradient is going to be a little bit lower out in here. So it's not going to be maintained as well. So that might raise our resting membrane potential, is one example. On the Nernst equation, so I'm just going to write that real quick. We got EX of negative 61 over Z. Z is the charge of the ion times the log of the ion on the inside of the cell over the log of the ion out of the cell. Okay, so what this is kind of helping us understand is how much is it inside, how much is it outside, what is the charge, and so this is going to kind of help us to determine whether it's wanting to go inside the cell. I guess that's a better way to draw the arrow, inside the cell or outside of the cell. And this was kind of how we determined driving force as well, because then we'll take this number, E of x, and then we'll subtract it from this negative 70. And that is where we can figure out whether it wants to go in or out. And driving force is just that this number, like I said, subtracted from that number to see whether it wants to go in or out and how much. If it's wanting to go out a lot, then it's going to have a higher driving force. Higher driving force. If it's, maybe just out a little bit, it'll have a little bit higher, like not as high, but still, a higher one. If it's wanting to rush in, depending on the charge, it might be a negative number. Okay, so there's that. And then for action potentials. Awesome. Let's get into that. So an action potential, I love to just draw a graph real quick, just so I can have it, Here, so we got negative 70 millivolts. This is resting membrane potential. Okay. I guess we want to put threshold though. Yeah, negative 70. And then, say threshold is 0. Okay. So our action potential is going to look kind of like this. Right? Maybe not quite like that. Let's it's not straight. Okay, gradient potential turn into exponential hyperpolarization, and then there. Okay, like that a lot better. Okay, so parts of this action potential that are important. Right here, you've got resting membrane potential, right? Let's make that a little smaller. Okay. Right here, you've got like a gradient potential, right? A little bigger. Gradient potential. Right here, you've got your depolarization, right? Getting more positive. And then over here, you've got a hyperpolarization, right? Repolarization. And then once we cross over resting membrane potential right there, it becomes hyperpolarization right here. Okay, before we get back into resting membrane potential. Another thing I think is important to talk about is refractory periods. So we've got an absolute refractory period and a relative refractory period. Absolute means that we cannot have another action potential. Cannot go again. Okay, we have to wait a little bit longer. Relative is we can, but the stimulus has to be a lot stronger or a lot longer. Okay, it's not going to be just a regular action potential. It can't be just a regular stimulus to set off the action potential. It has to be a lot more intense. Okay, so like our absolute refractory period is more like right here. Okay, and then right here is like our relative, because we could still get enough to come back up here and hit it, right? But up here, we're already past threshold, and so we're not going to be able to go again because we won't, like, these channels aren't closed, So there's that. Let me see. What else is there for the question? Prior to discuss exponentials. Okay, what happens during the exponential? Okay, so right here, we've got a graded potential. Okay, so what's happening here is we've got, a stimulus. Maybe it's a touch, right? You have a mechanically open sodium channel, which is going to let sodium come into the cell. Okay, once it hits threshold, we've got voltage gated sodium channels, voltage gated sodium, right? Those are going to open, and they open really fast. And so we have this shoot up real quick, become a lot more positive because sodium is rushing into the cell along its gradient. And then we have voltage gated potassium channels, right? They open kind of slow. So as we begin to have them open, we get positives rushing out of the cell, and so that's why it starts to come down. So once these inactivation gates for the sodium start to close, or I guess, yeah, start to close, I said that right, we start to come back down because we've still got the potassium that's rushing out, right? Through the sodium leak channels, we've got the voltage gated sodium channels are still kind of open, closing slowly. And then as they close, we still have those leak channels, and so we just get a little bit of the hyperpolarization, and then we reach equilibrium again as, those potassium leak channels kind of even out, the sodium potassium pump kind of make things come back to equilibrium, right? Get a little bit more negative, and the potassium kind of leak channels kind of help us balance out there. Okay, and that's kind of what's happening during a typical action potential. So I guess it's having like rising phase, falling phase. We've got like the rising phase here because it's rising, falling phase here because it's falling, right? After hyperpolarization right there. Relative refractory period again, like right there. Absolute refractory period right there again, like I was saying. Describe the actions of the channels involved in current ion currents, right? So right here, let me get rid of some of this stuff. It's getting messy. Okay. So right here in the rising phase, we've got sodium rushing into the cell, right? Guess I can in, sodium in. We've got potassium rushing out. Okay. But the sodium is going faster than the potassium. So that's why we've got an increase in our millivolts, right? It becomes less negative, more positive. And then over here, we've got less sodium rushing into the cell and more potassium rushing out. Wow. Right? So these sodium channels are pretty much already closed by this point. And mainly just our potassium channels are still trying to close a little bit. And our potassium leak channels are open. So the potassium's rushing into the cell a lot faster. Out of the cell a lot faster than anything that's coming into the cell. So that's why we get this repolarization. Okay. Okay, let me just make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, graded potentials and action potentials. What are different? What's the same? Graded potentials and action potentials, as far as I understand, only differ in whether or not they make it to threshold. So I'm going to draw my graded potentials in green, and I'll draw my action potentials in red. Okay, so we've got resting membrane potential right there, RMP. Graded potentials might come up, come back down. If we still get touch, maybe we're touching things, but we're used to it, so the mechanical gates aren't opening up as much. Maybe we've got potassium rushing out really fast because we've got a slow intake of sodium. So these aren't going to get up, so we don't actually send an impulse through the neuron up to the brain to say, hey, this is happening. So we don't get this, shoot up and come back down. We don't get that action potential. Whereas with this, we're at resting membrane potential. We hit the threshold, and that's when this becomes part of the action potential, rather than just a graded potential. And then it shoots up, comes back down, hyperpolarization, and that's when we get an action potential. When we hit threshold, that is what's going to be different about an action potential. Everything else, according to my understanding, before we hit threshold for an action potential and a graded potential are identical. It's just how much of a stimulus we're getting, how long is that stimulus happening, are we reaching threshold? And that's where it's going to change from an action or graded potential to an action potential. But the last thing we've got is capacitance and length constant. So capacitance is how easily do charges cross the membrane, right? And length constant is how far can a Bourn or that positive force field travel down the axon, right? How far can it go down this axon before negative proteins? Oh shoot! I just forgot everything else that's in there. Stop it. Other ions coming in or out of the cell. Just how long is it going to go for, right? So capacitance, I think of Rm, and oops, sorry Siri. And then length constant, I think of Ri. Those are the two things that I think of. How permeable is the membrane for Rm? How much stuff is going to be in the way for the Bourn to travel down for Ri? Okay, so capacitance length constant. Describe how capacitance length constant are affected by myelin. Myelin, right? So we've got our myelin sheath here. Stop, Siri. I don't know what I'm doing to get Siri up, but myelin sheath's right there. Okay, so we've got, we'll say this is the soma, right? The axon continues down, right? We've got our sodium leak channels right there. Not sodium leak channels, sorry, man. Sodium voltage gated sodium channels. Wow, that took me a second to get figured out there. Okay, action potential comes, activates that sodium channel. It opens up, sends sodium in. Okay. What this myelin is going to do to this action potential is it's going to separate these charges a lot more, right? So you've got negatives on the inside, right? Positives on the outside. These negatives are going to have a lot more of like a force field, right? Whereas right here, we're going to have our negatives right next to our positives, right? So they're going to be feeling each other, and they're going to be liking each other. They're not going to be really worried about other people, right? I kind of think of like single people and compared to married people. Married people, they're content with them. They don't really care what other people are doing. These people over here, they're interested in these guys, but they're still single. So if somebody else comes by, they're going to be like, oh, what are you doing? Type thing. And I don't know, it's kind of silly, but that's just kind of how I think about it. Right? So, so our internal resistance is going to go up just a little bit, but our RM is going to go way down, right? Or way up, because we're not going to have very many ions crossing this membrane. So when we get that force field coming through, we are going to have these negatives kind of feeling that, but they're not going to take too much off of it because there's only 3 of them, right? So we're going to hit here where we have another sodium voltage gated sodium channel. Man, too many channels in my head. And that one's going to continue the Bourn, right? And so what myelin does is it's going to increase the internal resistance just a little bit, because we're not going to have as much movement, but it's going to also increase the membrane like capacitance, right? So our membrane is going to be able to keep these positive charges in here so they can spread along further, right? Whereas without the myelin, we would have a lot more of these positives and negatives rushing out of the cell, getting pushed out when during this myelin, they can't go out because of all that fatty tissue right there, all that the Schwann cells and stuff, and that's my video.